Let's get a word on the big stories of the day, and there are plenty of them. The list seems to be growing by the moment. Theo Usherwood, the political commentator, is back with us. Afternoon to you, Theo.
A very good afternoon to you, Ian. Great to be with you.
And nice to have you with us. Before we get on to other issues, Kemi Badenoch delivering her first big speech of 2025. I was trying to think, is this her first big speech since becoming leader?
I think it is. I was thinking exactly the same thought, Ian. It is actually her first major speech since becoming leader of the Conservative Party. I think what's particularly interesting about it is that, the background to this is she's under pressure from her own party members to actually outline some policies, and she's resisted calls so far. And we're not expecting any policies to be announced in this speech, saying that she just wants to concentrate on telling the hard truths to the British public about the state that we find ourselves in today. That leaves open the door for Keir Starmer and others to say, well, you haven't come up with any alternatives. You can sit there and and the line that Keir Starmer uses regularly is you can carp from the sidelines. But you need to come up with some alternatives as to what decisions you would take. And it was part of Keir Starmer's refrain yesterday at PMQs, and it's been part of his refrain at PMQs previously, is that Kemi Badenoch can say that she doesn't like the increase in national insurance contribution. She can say she's opposed to removing half the exemption for inheritance tax for farmers, but she then needs to come up with an alternative, or the winter fuel allowance for that matter, but she then needs to come up with an alternative as to where she would find the money. And that's problematic for Kemi Badenoch, but of course she is in opposition and she wants to put up put up a fight to Keir Starmer, but without actually detailing what she would do if she were Prime Minister. She does leave herself open to the charge that she's simply criticising and commentating from the sidelines without actually coming up with a plan for government.
Some, of course, would say, well, that's kind of part of the deal, unfortunately, of being the leader of the opposition rather than in government. Let's just dip in for a second, Theo, and let's get a sense of the tone of the Conservative leader as she makes that first big speech.
What is going to generate wealth for our country. Christopher, GB News.
Christopher, GB News. Kemi Badenoch, it's mid-January. It's the first time you've given a speech, a policy-free speech. The polls have reform ahead of you in the polls. You're going backwards, according to YouGov for this week. Why have you allowed Nigel Farage to make all the running, become the voice of the right, as he seems to be at the moment? And can you answer yes or no, will the Tories and Reform UK merge to beat Labour before the next election?
Thank you, Chris, for your wonderful question. So first of all, I will start by saying that Nigel Farage says he wants to destroy the Conservative Party. Why on earth would we merge with that? First of all. But on the point of not having policies, I've just told you, Chris, policies without plans are just announcements. What the Labour Party has been doing, what Reform is doing, is making announcements. We did that as well, and people didn't like it. How well did net zero work? That was the policy. Where was the plan? So what I'm saying is that we're not going to start making promises without plans.
And that is the part of the speech, Theo, where the real meat of that question, which came from a down-market TV station, asking about the Nigel Farage relationship. That's the bit that everybody wants to know about, and she had a quick answer and then went elsewhere. And I don't think she's going to go back to the Farage question.
No, but the interesting thing is, never mind the general election, Ian, what about this by-election that's up and coming in Runcorn?
Yeah.
Now, the Labour have a majority over Reform, who came second in Runcorn, of around 14,000. It is perfectly winnable for either Reform or the Conservatives if one party backs away. But if they continue to go into that election, both the Conservatives and Reform, fighting toe-to-toe on the doorstep and canvassing on the doorstep, it's very likely they'll split the right of centre vote again, and Labour will retain that seat.
Yep.
So in the short term, there is a real challenge here or real opportunity, I should say, depending on whether you're a glass half full or glass half empty person, whether Reform says, actually, can we do a deal in the short term, just on this by-election? We could win it for Nigel Farage's party. Nigel Farage can win it. But of course, that would give the Conservatives that would knock the wind out of Kemi Badenoch's sails. Reform would get their 6th MP, more momentum, and we would end up in it. And you would look at it and think, actually, Kemi Badenoch, from Conservative strategist point of view, would far rather that Labour won that seat, retain that seat over Reform, because then at least it would take the wind out of the sails of the Nigel Farage's party. The worst case scenario for Kemi Badenoch is if Nigel Farage wins that seat. So there's no at the moment there's no incentive for her to do a deal, but I think it would be perfectly winnable. And the majority is such, it's 14,000, where you could actually see it happening. And it's such a chunky majority that actually it would be a real boon for Farage to overturn that majority and win that seat for his party. But there's no incentive for Kemi Badenoch, at the moment at least, to give way.
I thought one of the other interesting aspects of this speech, I don't know whether she's come to it yet, we're sort of dipping in and out, but of course we do get a little preamble as to what the areas are that they are likely to discuss. She's going to criticise her own party over the handling of Brexit. Admitting that past mistakes and call for plans of aligning with public trust and the like. Now, it's going to be interesting, the Brexit one. You know, I've heard a lot of people today saying, you know, are the Conservative Party going to suddenly become more cosy with the EU than the Labour Party? Are they going to take that fairly high-risk strategy, but will they go that way around trying to win favour or mark themselves out as a different party?
I think the problem for the Conservative Party when it comes to Brexit is that actually, if you look at the theory of Brexit, it's quite a good idea. We turn our face towards much larger markets, whether they be America or the BRICS economies, and we say we want to export to you, and we're willing to do deals that will allow you to sell your products into the UK or into Great Britain, I should say, because of Northern Ireland is not part of this arrangement, with much greater ease and alacrity. The problem, of course, is that to jump through those hoops, you have to make a number of changes to your own. We'd have to make a number of changes to our own internal standards. So, particularly, let's say if we wanted to do a deal with a trade deal with the US, for the likes of Mike Pompeo, who was Secretary of State when Donald Trump was first in office, he was absolutely adamant that American food companies should be able to export into the British market. Yeah. But that would have a huge impact on British farmers and, of course, food standards in this country, because the Americans have much lower food standards compared to our own food standards here in Britain. And there wasn't an honesty about actually the internal changes that we would have to make in order to make those trade deals with the likes of America work. And actually, when you look at what large businesses, and I'm talking about corporate businesses which trade between jurisdictions, mainly with the European Union, on a hourly, daily basis, and we're talking about just-in-time supply chains, particularly around the car industry, the sense or the jump that would have to be made to give all of that up to then go and face towards America was simply too great. And that's why Brexit ended up hurting us, because we weren't able to make that leap to face towards America and economies outside of the European Union. And it's interesting to hear Kemi Badenoch talk about Brexit in this way, because it does give the sense that actually, whilst we've seen a lot of the language from the Conservative right point towards, reform and the concerns about reform, the reality of what's being promised by reform is not. There's a feeling within, that actually is not going to materialise in a way that would make the British people better off.
There it is. It's going to be interesting, isn't it? Imagine the Brexit debate coming back every flipping day that you're on air. Goodness me. We only had, 9 years of it. Let's talk about Yvette Cooper announcing these new local inquiries into grooming gangs. I mean, this is kind of interesting. Clearly, Labour sat down and went, look, we've got to do something. There's clearly public feeling about this. They had ruled out a national inquiry. Now, then their position, of course, softened very quickly, didn't it? Over a sort of a day, they suddenly started talking about, well, maybe we could do something, and this is what they've come up with. Local inquiries, the problem with that, of course, is that local inquiries don't have the same teeth and authenticity as a national inquiry does.
You're quite right to point that out. And this is about looking at patterns, both in terms of the perpetrators of these horrendous, heinous crimes, whether it be their ethnicity or whatever, and saying what factor did that play. It's also about looking at the failures of social services and the police right across the board. And you can see there is some merit in local inquiries in terms of giving a voice to the victims, and the voice of the victims, I think, is very important. But in terms of looking at the structural issues that allowed these crimes, and in some cases there are fears, allow these crimes to continue being committed, it's very difficult to see how a local inquiry will necessarily get to the bottom of those particular issues. What is being called for, and I think Kemi Badenoch has a point with this, is a national inquiry which joins the dots together and to look at the patterns that led to these crimes being committed, and would then produce recommendations which would look at a national level at stopping them being committed in future. And it's those lessons, I think, which are really important to make sure that these crimes aren't committed in the future, and if they are continuing, to make sure that they stop. But when you look at a local inquiry, it could end up being very bitty in terms of the recommendations that come out of them, and what does the government do to take them forward. It's really important when you have issues like this, which are so serious, and you're ensuring you really need to get justice for the victims, that you come out with a very stringent set of recommendations that can be implemented very quickly, and you can tick them off one by one whether the government has done them. And if you end up with lots of different strands to this, it can become diluted very quickly.
Absolutely. And if you don't get the right people around the table giving evidence, then the whole thing collapses anyway. The credibility is shot. We'll see how that is going to manifest and when it will as well. We'll hear that speech from Yvette Cooper as well throughout the course, I think, of this hour. And finally, look, we've known each other a while. Theo, you've been covering politics for a long, long time. Have you ever known a time when there wasn't a story that the NHS is absolutely on its knees? I guess we could argue we're in a new stratosphere now of trouble with the NHS, and this report from the Royal College of Nursing, 460-page report, 5,000 members, some absolutely horrendous stories coming out of that. And, of course, Wes Streeting can blame the previous government. He wouldn't be completely inaccurate on that. But now it falls to him to sort this thing out.
It does. I think Wes Streeting is I think he's one of the more capable ministers, if not the most capable minister within Keir Starmer's cabinet. But when you look at the problems within the NHS, how deep-rooted they are, and how they go beyond the NHS itself. So you end up in a situation where, they kick the thorny issue of social care away. They said, we can't, they're going to come up with recommendations. Louise Casey's going to come up with recommendations in 2028. That's a year before the next election. Actually, when you go into hospitals, when you go into those wards, they are often wards which are filled with people who could just as well be in a social care setting, elderly people who could just as well be either being cared for at home with carers or being in a nursing home. But of course, they've got nowhere to go and they've got no one to look after them, and therefore they have to remain in hospital. And the problems are so deep-rooted, and we're seeing people, waiting. I saw one case study where somebody was waiting for 96 hours in an A&E department for a bed. And unless we get to grips with what's underpinning the problem, which is a lack of social care, then I don't see how Wes Streeting's going to get on top of this. I think he's got a pass for this winter. I think he'll be allowed, this winter. I think there's an appreciation that, OK, Labour can turn around and say, this is a Conservative inheritance. If we're having the same conversation this time next January, Ian, and I suspect we would be, then I think that's a real problem for Wes Streeting and the Labour government, who are promising to deliver results.
Indeed. Theo, thank you. Theo Usherwood, political commentator with us on the programme. We'll continue to take your calls and responses on the NHS. How do we resurrect this thing? There's all the obvious, they sound like cliches now, but it all happens to be true. There are no country around the world has ever replicated the NHS. Countries that have a sort of private insurance system in place, which is kind of often cheaper than our national insurance, but invariably in similar-sized economies, roughly about the same. still free from cradle to grave and all the rest of it, that function better. You know, why are there better outcomes in France? Why does Spain have better outcomes on cancer and cardio issues? Why would that be?